They don't just want deportations. They want mass deportations. That's the phrase they'd use. Would you be comfortable saying you're in favour of mass deportations? Hello, this is John McGuirk. Welcome back to Gript Media. On the 26th of April this year, tens of thousands of people took to the streets of Dublin to protest what they see as excessive immigration into Ireland. There was a sea of tricolours, there was a massive ocean of people, and there were several people who were putative leaders. It is a movement, the Irish anti-immigration movement, though, that has been criticised in some areas for a lack of direction and a lack of focus. And so today I'm joined by one of the people who has, over the last couple of years, emerged as somebody who lays claim to leadership of at least part of that movement, and that is Aontú leader Peadar Tóibín. Peadar, it's good to see you.
Thanks. Good to see yourself as well.
We'll start actually with more recent developments. Keir Starmer, the UK Prime Minister, over the last week, launched what anyone who's watched the Labour Party in Britain over the last 20 years would say is an enormous U-turn on immigration. He says immigration must come down in the United Kingdom. He says there's a risk that that country's been turned into an island of strangers. The response to that here in Ireland has been very muted. What's your response to it? And do you think, as somebody who I think has a background in the left, do you think what he says about the country becoming an island of strangers is something that might happen here as well?
Yeah, so there's definitely a big shift in policy by the Labour Party. There's no doubt about it. But it's happening really throughout all of Europe. So parties of the left either have to, accept it and work with it, or find their votes just absolutely being atomized and being lost. So Keir Starmer had no other option in relation to this. Britain has seen big changes. Like one given year, 1 million people coming into the country. They reckon that 1 million people don't speak English at the moment within Britain. And these are significant changes in any society. And when those types of changes happen, there needs to be some kind of democratic oversight of it. And even an opportunity to, for people to say yes or no, depending on what their views are. In terms of Ireland and how it will affect Ireland, and there is a significant potential effects to Ireland in that we're often part of the same flows of people. Indeed, 80% of the people coming into this state are coming from Britain, a safe country, through the north of Ireland. And also when the Rwanda project was in place, that was a significant driver of people coming from Britain into this state as well. And the final point I would say is, it is the right of any democratic people to be able to decide what proportion of people who live in the country shall be from outside of the country. It is it's not a racist decision. It's not a xenophobic decision. It is simply how we plan and organize our country, because so many of the delivery of services, of housing, all of those issues are dependent upon the number of people that we allow into a country.
So Keir Starmer is a man of the left. He's always been a liberal. Mark Steyn, the Canadian columnist, always says that the objective of politics is to move people to your point of view. Keir Starmer has clearly been moved to this point of view. Well, and you can look at a direct cause of that, which is the recent UK local elections, where Reform UK under Nigel Farage had an enormous breakthrough. And 2 weeks later, there's a massive change in immigration policy on behalf of the UK Labour government. When a lot of people look around at the Irish political firmament, they say we need the government to be moved to a particular point of view. That's where they're coming from. Why do you think it isn't happening?
Well, first of all, I will say there has been some movement in the government. So we in Aontú have been raising this issue consistently since our formation in 2019. And actually, at the time, we were hammered on high from parties like Sinn Féin for even raising the particular issue. We have probably brought 90% of the information that exists in terms of immigration. It was Aontú that brought that into the public domain. So even this week, we found out that the government are spending 1.2 billion euros this year on iPass, which works out at about 33,000 euros per person per year, 100 euros per person per night, which is an extremely high piece of information. We found out that figure about 80% of people coming from the north of Ireland. We found out the figure about 80% of people not being forcibly removed from this country when they failed their deportation figures as well. So by injecting that information into the public domain, we believe that we have been a significant contributor to the actual debate happening at some level in this country. The reason why it hasn't happened to the same level as Britain is, one, we have a media that's more concentrated in the same space. Britain has a left wing and a right wing and a centrist media, so the oxygen of political debate exists in all of those spaces in Britain, while it doesn't really happen here. And the second thing is the first past the post system, to a certain extent, really forces big changes very quickly in terms of voting results. 5 or 6% change in a political party's vote could actually mean a 70 or 80% change in the number of MPs that get elected as well. So that issue, because of the realpolitik, has manifested itself in Britain, but hasn't manifested itself as much in Ireland. The second issue, and an issue I think that's really important, is in Ireland, a lot of that energy is going into a sector of politics which is a perfect example of chaos. And there is a sector of politics in around the migration issue which is leaderless, which is free of strategy, which is full of aggression, and which in reality is sucking energy and collecting energy from people, but not producing any output in terms of politics. And if you look at a lot of the micro-organizations that inhabit that particular space, they're all in chaos. They're all either losing their leaders, or they are people, their few handful of elected reps are actually leaving them at the moment, or they're fighting with each other. And you know, my worry is that political space is actually a gift to Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Sinn Féin. If I was the government, I would be absolutely delighted with the political chaos that exists in that space, because it neuters that political space. It kills any opportunity for that political space to actually play a real role in the political experience of this country and having any long-term influence at all. And, you know, I remember when we were founded first in 2019, I did a public meeting in Longford, and one of the members of these micro groups was at the meeting, and he heckled me throughout the whole meeting. And at the end of the meeting, he went up to me and said, like, why are you heckling me on these issues when, you know, Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael and Sinn Féin are, you know, the difficulty for you? And he winks at me and he goes, Peadar, sure, we're fishing from the same pond. And that came, let me know, I suppose, that these individuals were nearly more interested in their own armpit politically than actually a big strategic project to achieve an objective. And if you look at, for example, social media is hammered with so many individual accounts that aim to pull down, to trash, to break up, to have a negative influence on all around them, rather than building strategically, rather than trying to work with individuals who might have, you know, some ability to pull people together. And, you know, we had, for example, an interesting experience there a fortnight ago in Trim.
This is Trim, yes.
Yeah. So in Trim, we held a public meeting on an iPass location in Trim, and our local councillor Dave Boyne, held the meeting. He organised it in part with two community groups within Trim. He got the permission for the location. He brought the audio equipment, etc. And he was good enough to pass the microphone to an individual who spoke at the end of the meeting. And that individual who spoke at the end of the meeting, rather than actually see an opportunity to kind of bring people, create connections, to create alliances, to join energy, ripped into Dave, etc., and made a lot of allegations that were completely untrue. So made allegations that Aontú haven't been involved in trying to politically push back against the government in any way over the last 5 years, when patently that is not the case. And of course, after the meeting, the individual goes up with the phone into the face, and rather than let the person answer, there's a gotcha moment for social media to throw up and to distort literally what actually happens at that particular meeting. Now, 80% of the people at that meeting were fully behind Dave's perspective, were fully, understood that Dave was doing good work on that. But from the results in terms of social media, there was a complete distortion of what happened there. And, I've seen that happen over and over again, where we had a public meeting in Artane, for example, on roughly the same issue. The guy, again, from a micro-organisation came to it, and, he actually hugged me and told me he loved me. It was a pretty strange experience, I'll tell you. But then recorded the whole meeting and took 20 seconds of the meeting, put it up on social media, again, completely distorting what the whole meeting was about. And, these individuals, first of all, they have to realise that if you want to build a long-term political movement, one, you have to have integrity. Because if you keep burning anybody around you in terms of potentially achieving something, people simply won't work with you after a while. That's the first thing. And the second thing is, if you keep telling untruths, after a while, your currency in terms of people's views is completely ruined as well. So, in the long term, if people want to build a political organization, they have to, one, have integrity, two, be believable and trustworthy in terms of their message. And, you know, the last point I would say in this is, I would say on social media, you probably have political actors who are now just throwing out the most controversial statements in order to get the most hits, to monetize actually their views. And I actually think that the monetization of their views is nearly more important than any political outcome in terms of a political project. And, you know, it used to be said, for example, that the left was so fractured that it couldn't agree on the time of day, that they couldn't, you know, manage to work together, and therefore their energy was completely dissipated. And yet we're seeing that on the other side of that horseshoe, that the far right are in a situation where that's exactly the same situation happening for them. And, you know, there is, in politics, there's a number of things that are important. Yes, you have to have a political compass. Yes, you have to have your objectives, but you have to be able to have the ability to realize that when those objectives meet the real world, that there has to be some level of cohesion in terms of working with other people to achieve them.
But let's turn that because you, in fairness, you've said a lot there, and for clarity, I agree with a lot of it. I think a lot of people out there listening to this interview agree with a lot of it. But isn't it also the case, Peadar, that you have an obligation to win those voters? Of those 10,000 people who are marching through the streets of Dublin, I don't know what proportion of them were Aontú voters, but I know a lot of them, because our reporters were there, don't give your party the time of day because they say they're not tough enough. They don't stand up for us enough. They're not, you know, they're not here standing beside us today. Whether individuals who your party were or not, I don't know, but that's the kind of thing that gets said. And ultimately, you and people like Independent Ireland, you people are in an elected office. Like, isn't there a responsibility on you to lead more aggressively as well?
Well, first of all, I will say that a large number of people at that particular march were ordinary Irish people with real concerns and real frustrations in trying to communicate to the powers that be to make a change. There's absolutely no doubt about that at all. And yes, I believe that we actually have a responsibility in terms of leadership to people who feel that way in this country, because for the first part, you know, I believe that their objectives are real. But for the second part, actually, I believe that if there isn't a reasonable organisation providing leadership, there's a danger that many of these people can actually get, let's say, manipulated by, you know, extreme forces within the country. Secondly, that I would say is that, you know, any development of an of a march or something like that, it would have political parties coming together to develop a committee. It would then identify 5 or 6 objectives that everybody could sort of agree with, and then it would produce a list of speakers who would speak at the particular event. And that's certainly not the case that's happening at the moment in those particular marches. And I'll be straight with you. Like, there are other elements, a minority of those elements at those marches that we don't agree with in terms of the particular position that they're taking. And, you know, I'm thinking of the likes of the Justin Barrett, for example. I know he was at the periphery, he wasn't at the centre of that. But yet, like, in an interview with an individual, he quite clearly states that there's nothing wrong with nationalist socialism, and they knew what to do with Jewish people as well. So for a political party like ourselves, it is very, very important that we have absolutely nothing to do with characters like that. And those individuals are toxic. They atomize the political spectrum. And the danger is for anybody that is in a mile or two of them, there's going to be obviously damage done to those individuals. Never mind the fact that we absolutely disagree with their perspective. But the point that I'm saying here, which is important, there is this kind of, you know, perspective amongst some on both extremes of the political system, that they are holier than thou, that they only hold the truth, that if you don't adhere 100% to their doctrine, you are enemy number one in terms of those politics, in terms of that politics. But the way the political system actually works is that you try to work with people who are beside you in the political spectrum to achieve what you want to achieve. But the way that Irish politics often works is you compete with other people who are beside you the most, because your instinct is you're fishing from that particular pond. Now, that's the cynical politics, and the politics that ends up going nowhere.
So, what I'm hearing here from you, Peadar, and I think you're right, for the record, is that you need to have shared objectives. But I think what people will want to hear from this interview is, what do you think those shared objectives should be when it comes on immigration? And I'm going to ask you a few questions just on this. So if you talk to a lot of people on those marches, they'll say they don't just want deportations. They want mass deportations. That's the phrase they'd use. Would you be comfortable saying you're in favour of mass deportation?
Okay, so our policy is simple. We want to see a significant reduction in the number of people coming to this country in terms of IPAS, and we want to see a reduction in the number of people who are currently getting economic visas into the country. In relation to IPAS, we believe that reduction can be achieved by implementing the process in a far stricter fashion and making sure that all people who fail the process, and that process should be no more than 3 months from start to finish, all people who fail that are forced to leave the country in terms of deportations. And I think that if we achieve that, we will be able to adhere to common sense in terms of migration, but also to an objective which is important to us as well, that if you're actually fleeing war and violence, I still want this country to be able to do something for you in terms of help. If your house was on fire tonight, I believe as your neighbour, I do have a responsibility to try and look after you until you get back up on your feet. Now, I do think countries like Denmark have actually shown that you can still adhere to those objectives, but still radically reduce the number of people who are coming to your country. Because here's what's happened in Ireland over the last 15 years, especially the last 5 years, is the government have sent out a message loud and clear that if you come to this country, first of all, the application process is so loose, you're most likely to actually be successful. It takes so long, you'll be here for 3, 4, 5, 6 years. If you fail the first application, you can then appeal it, which will take a number of years also. If you fail the appeal, you can then go for a judicial review, which will take a number of years also. If you fail the judicial review, you may get a deportation order, but 85% of you will not be removed from the country because the country does not have a system which is able to do that. And we've found out by PQ this week that the government have overturned or quashed 4,000 deportation orders in the last 10 years. There has been about 5 times the number of deportation orders quashed this year so far by Minister O'Callaghan than there actually has been deportation orders enforced as well. So that's our policy, and it's a straight-up policy, and it won't be enough for many people, and that's fine. But my instinct is, if it's not enough for other people, the logic would be that you would not kick the shins out of that particular position because it ends up helping Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael, Sinn Féin and the Green Party in the long run. I honestly believe Aontú was a party that grew the most in terms of votes of any political party in the last general election. And I do believe that we have the best organised party to be able to challenge mainstream establishment politics here. But I have no doubt that it creates a massive smile on the faces of the political establishment when they see the fractured, chaotic elements within those micro-organisations trying to do down the only real opposition that exists in terms of Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Sinn Féin.
On the other hand, though, we've just got news today that the proposed IPAS centre in Coolock, I don't know if you heard of that, is not now going to proceed. After a protest there by local people that was at times fractious, at times angry, and at times frankly unpleasant. And I don't say that to attack the people who were involved in that protest. I'm saying it was street warfare on some levels, and that has happened. But a lot of people, I think, Peadar, who are looking at your party would say, well, Aontú weren't there with us in Coolock. And like, did you accept that criticism?
Now, I suppose here's the first thing, right? There were people standing on top of Garda cars, smashing off Garda cars outside of Coolock. There's no way that Aontú can be part of that. And that is the reality. We will not be part of destruction of property or people's lives. Secondly, as well, you've got to realise this. Middle Ireland, when they look at situations like that actually does damage in many ways to the cause of people who want to see a tougher immigration system in this country. Because what it does, it allows the establishment compartmentalise and pigeonhole people who may have a particular view against the government's policies. So we obviously think, one, it's wrong to cause danger to people's lives and to smash their property. Two, it's also counterproductive. Now, and as well, like, this is really important too. There are people who use words like plantation and they use, very kind of strong, what I would call ethno-nationalist language in relation to this. I feel very strongly that, there needs to be a situation where people who are citizens of this country, many of them of different color, many of them living for a long period of time in this country, and many of them even born in this country, we cannot have a situation where people live in fear or feel that their lives are under threat in any ways. And we stand against that. And also, Middle Ireland, when they hear words like plantation, when they hear words like chemtrails, when they hear words like crystals and leprechauns, they just lose. They lose any kind of interest they have in a particular message. And so I'm saying is that there is a section of this particular movement which is completely switched off to the fact that their message is actually shutting people's minds against their particular views. And the one thing is, and you know this as well as I do, if you design a message, you need that message to be, you want to design it so Middle Ireland can understand it. So you want, and go back to the very first question, you want the message so Middle Ireland will be persuaded by it. There's a segment of the very far edges of this particular movement who are doing significant damage to a reasonable discussion of citizens around what our country will be like, how we will deal with the number of newcomers that are coming into the country, how we can make sure that it's a strict system, that it reduces in numbers, that it becomes to a sustainable situation in this country. And they do that at the same time thinking in some way that they are the people who are really standing up for Ireland.
I want to move slightly, but on a similar theme, because we've talked a lot about the fractiousness of the movement outside of elected politics. And I think many of your criticisms are well made. But isn't it also possible to turn that criticism back on what's happening in elected politics? Because you look at the movement, and maybe it's the electoral system, but you've got yourselves with your 2 TDs, you've got Independent Ireland with a few TDs, you've got a bunch of independents like Carol Nolan, Maddie McGrath, and so on. All of whom broadly, I think it's fair to say, sing from the same, if not the same hymn sheet, then you're all familiar with the tunes. Then you've got people like the Healy Rays who've obviously gone into government. There's no real coherent position on this in elected politics against the government. And don't some of you as politicians, and Independent Ireland aren't sitting in front of me, for example, so I would ask the same question of them, just for clear. Carly, don't you have, your party name is Aontú, which means unity. Isn't there an obligation on people like you to bring more unity together?
Yeah, listen, it is probably the issue of biggest frustration to me is the fact that the political system finds it very, very difficult to work with. So before Independent Ireland was founded, I went to some of those individuals and I said, listen, I can't understand why you would set up a parallel organisation to one that's already in existence. We've actually built the house. We have 66 functioning common around the country. Now, for their own particular reasons, many of them felt actually they wanted to remain that independent individual status themselves. At the time, I don't think they wanted to take positions on the right to life or gender ideology, for example. And they felt probably it was easy for them to maintain the seats. And I will say this, and this is I don't want to disparage anybody, but sometimes when people make an ideological commitment to a political party, it is a risk in terms of, will they be able to maintain their seats in the local areas? But there's no doubt, again, it is an absolute weakness of our political space to operate in a fractured manner. And other people, will say, well, what has Aontú done? And over the last while, I'll say this, it is not hard to set up, it's not easy to set up a political organization. It is damnable hard to set up a political organization. I don't know, for example, if I would have been able to go through the last 6 years that I went through in the next 6 years, just physically able to do that level of work. We did all of that without funding. We did all of that against the prevailing wind of the majority of the media in this country. And we ended up in the last election with the biggest increase of votes of any political party. And people will say, well, you have 2 TDs, you have a senator, and you have about 8 councillors. And that's true. But we're actually at the precipice at the moment of actually making big political gains. And, there is a choice that people have to make in terms of politics is there's egos, there's people who are careful about whether they'll keep their seat or not, and there's people who want just that level of independence or not. But for us, it is about the bigger picture. It's about what is the most strategic, speediest way for us to get from here to there. And there's no doubt in my mind, the fastest way to get from here to the objective that we want to get is by a mass movement of members across the country working together. And, the membership element is absolutely key in this. And, there's probably, I would say, and I don't want to go publicly, there's none of those independents that we've discussed or you've mentioned there that we haven't sought to sit down with and ask them to come on board and to get involved in our organisation. And even, I'll tell you, this is another interesting point. Labour Party got 4.7% in the last election. Soc Dems got 4.8. Both came out with about 11 or 12 seats. We got 3.9 and we came out with 2 seats. So the vote bonus for them was massive. Why? Because they managed to transfer like hell to each other. So there is a pool, basically, a soft left political pool now of the Soc Dems, Labour, the Greens, and kind of people for profit, and some of Sinn Féin feed into that as well. But they are wise and clever enough to be able to work together to make sure that they get far more bang for our buck. Our system is fractured, it's angry, it's aggressive, it's turning in on each other. It's fighting with each other, and it would rather kick the shins out of each other and help people that they disagree with than actually work with each other. And that is a living example of political stupidity.
I want to end actually on a point of some optimism, which is that at the last general election, you obviously did almost double your vote. You doubled your number of seats. You've added a senator to the stable. You have 3 members of the Oireachtas. And you have access to something which you didn't have before, which is a not insubstantial pool of state funding. How are you going to be investing that money over the next few years? And what is the outlook for Aontú?
Yeah, and the people cannot understand how important that state funding is, in fairness.
What does it allow you to do that you weren't able to do?
So, for example, we've employed now 4 organisers around the country. In each province, there's an organiser who's working in the constituencies, building, coming, making sure that they're campaigning, making sure that they're selecting local area reps, making sure those local area reps are out on the streets on particular issues, or communicating their message on the media. We've already employed about 2 or 3 more people in Leinster House. We have a bigger team there as well, obviously with 3 Oireachtas members. And, just positions like, General Secretary, and, we've been able to put paid people into those positions, which were volunteer positions. So much of that work was carried out by myself and 2 or 3 other people who were volunteers over the last number of years. So that takes a lot of pressure off us in that respect. So for us, over the next while, we have a number of objectives. We are looking at the presidential election. We are potentially looking at an Aontú candidate in relation to the presidential election, or maybe even giving support to another candidate in that election. We have 2 elections in the north of Ireland. We have a local and a Stormont election in 2027, and we have to get ready for that. We were at Ordesh on Saturday, the 24th of May. Which will be a big event for us. But I have no doubt, if you look at people like Becky Keeley, who lost out by 60 votes in Kanturk in the last local election, a raft of people around the country have built over the years to being on the precipice at the edge of taking seats. And now we have to grow the movement to be able to build and take those seats in the subsequent elections. And the last thing I'll say is, the referendum's gone by. We obviously took, actually in this room, the Ard Comhairle of Aontú took a decision around that. We will continue to stand up for what we believe in on the issues that are very important against the prevailing wind, even if there's a cost to us politically. And I remember in this room, people said, we're mad making this decision. We will pigeonhole, the media will come out against us like a ton of bricks, and it'll do us damage. And I said, we either stand up for what we believe in, or we fold the tent and go home. There's no reason to have Aontú unless we stand up for what we believe in. Now, one other political party claims to have supported that particular referendum, but as one of our councillors very well said, he said, it's a pity they didn't support our position before the votes were counted. And that's the difference here. And, there's an integrity, I think, in our politics. We may not fully agree with a lot of people who are, out there on issues, but we will stand exactly our ground on this, and we will fight to make sure that that's implemented in this country. All
right, well, we'll leave it there. Listen, you've had an opportunity now to listen to Peadar's views on these issues. Peadar, thanks you very much for joining us, and good luck with the future for Aontú over the next few years as you continue to grow.
Thanks very much, John.